Idlanite, Anitsaqua, Tawo, Hakoda, and Tonshi. I would like to acknowledge that Saskatchewan Polytechnic is situated on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories and the ancestral lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aidan Megan. I'm the Director of Library and Testing Services, and I'm very pleased to introduce this session, Unbottling Gen AI, a workshop exploring generative AI and open educational resources. This workshop will last for an hour and a half, and if you're unable to stay for the entire duration, you will receive a link to the recording within the next few days. The recording will be available on the SAS Polytech YouTube page. In today's workshop, we will explore the potential of using generative AI to create content for an open education resource, OER, textbook. We will consider both the positive and negative implications of this technology. Our focus will be on the practical applications, where you will have the opportunity to co-create a textbook chapter and discover how AI can be utilized in OER. Additionally, our workshop leaders will delve into important legal and ethical issues such as copyright and privacy. We are joined today by Will Engel. He is the Open Education Initiative Strategist at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology at the University of British Columbia. He is deeply involved in projects that leverage emerging technologies and pedagogies to support open learning. As a strategist for open education initiatives, Will has contributed to a variety of projects, including supporting open pedagogy-based assignments that emphasize students as collaborators in production of knowledge, effectively integrating open resources into individual courses, developing UBC's massive open online courses, or MOOCs, and organizing learning analytics hackathons for undergraduate students. With a master's degree in library science, Will is passionate about removing barriers that limit access to education and knowledge. Thanks for joining us today, Will. We also have Lucas Wright, who is the Senior Educational Consultant at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, also at the University of British Columbia. In this role, Lucas supports faculty and staff in integrating technology into their teaching and learning practices. With over 15 years of experience as an adult learning instructor, Lucas has taught online, face-to-face, and blended contexts. He has a keen interest in blended learning, open education, and the role of learning portfolios in enhancing teaching and learning. Thank you, Will and Lucas, for joining us today, and I turn the session over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. And we're just getting set up on our slides. Before we get started, Lucas, if you'd like to go to the next slide. We'd like to acknowledge that both Lucas and I are located at UBC Vancouver, and we're located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And as we're going to be talking about open education today, I'd also like to acknowledge that many ideas in open education are grounded in Western notions. And these Western notions, such as copyright, ownership, IP, can sometimes be in tension with traditional and ancestral ways of knowing. Next slide, please. And we're not going to be digging specifically into those tensions in this workshop today. I would like to acknowledge that Kayla Larson, who is the Indigenous Programs and Services Librarian at Weewa Library, did a chat on this exact topic a few years ago, and the recording of that chat is just fantastic. And if you're interested in understanding some of the tensions that can exist between open and Indigenous knowledge and sovereignty, I highly recommend that you check this out. I'm just going to drop a link to it in the chat. Next slide. So for this session, we're going to be providing just a brief overview or an introduction to generative AI and open educational resources. And we're going to be looking at how Gen AI can be used to support or enhance the creation of OER. We're going to be then also looking at some of the considerations for the use of Gen AI around OER. And we have this acronym PEBC. And specifically, we want to look at things like privacy, equity, bias, and copyright. What are sort of the ramifications or considerations that AI might be bringing into the open space? We'll also be looking at how AI may be pushing OER in the future and where the directions are currently heading and what sort of trends and impacts we're seeing right now. And then also, we kind of hope this session maybe you'll leave with a draft chapter section of an open textbook, and we're going to ask you to follow along and take it up some activities as we go through this. And before we get started, I'd also just like to acknowledge that, we already know that a lot of people are using AI, including our students. So this is a article that came out last summer in July of 2024, and I'm sure the number is a magnitude higher by now. But in last summer, we saw textbook companies like Pearson, and Wiley and others beginning to implement AI tools directly into the textbooks that students were being asked to purchase. And these AI tools were pretty robust. There were things like chatbots where students could go into the textbook, and if they didn't understand something, they could ask a chatbot um, for explanations or more resources or information, or directly within the textbooks, there were things like practice questions that were AI sort of fed, and students could test their understanding and get sort of direct one-on-one feedback from an AI on their understanding of some of the concepts in there. So AI is becoming sort of already default in how students are accessing their learning materials, and it's definitely something that is already out there. With that, I'll hand it over to Lucas to talk a little bit about some of the tools and activities we'll be doing.
Wonderful. So we have an hour and a half together, which is great because we can do a lot of interaction. And I think when we're working with generative AI and actually open as well, I think getting hands-on and really playing with these tools and thinking about how they work is really important. And I think we're really at an early stage of generative AI, and it's a stage of experimentation where we can start thinking of ways that generative AI can impact teaching, learning, and open education. And I've shared a link in the chat with you. I'll just share it again in case someone came a little bit late. And that link leads to a Google document. And what you'll find in the Google document is it's a worksheet. You'll see a table of contents at the start, and then all of the activities we talk about are outlined on the worksheet. So as we go through this session, we're going to be assisting you or supporting you building a page in an open textbook. That's one of our goals. I'll also mention in terms of tools, we would like you to have one LLM or one large language model, one AI tool open in another tab to play with, but we're pretty agnostic about what you want it to be. So you can be Copilot if you want, Chat GPT if you would like. Keep in mind, if you're uncomfortable logging into these systems, you can use Chat GPT without a login. Use it in an incognito window, etc. But please feel free to use DeepSeek, Gemini, Claude, whatever you're most comfortable with. So let's start with a little bit of an intro to OER and generative AI overall. And I want to start with the definition of generative AI. This is from Wikipedia. I'll give you a second to read this. And a couple pieces I wanted to draw attention to in this definition. One is AI isn't new. It's been around for more than 60 years. Generative AI is a little bit newer, and I think it's important we differentiate the two. So generative AI is AI that generates something new. It could be text, it could be images, it could be videos, and it does this by learning patterns and the structure of the inputted training data. I think I wanted to draw attention to that point as well, because when we see these models make errors, when we see them having limitations, it's important to realize what their architecture is, meaning they are using complex word prediction. They're not thinking, they're not reasoning, and they're not endowed with wisdom, although it's easy to think that. I used one as a counselor over Christmas, for example. So what are they trained on? I think when we think about open education and generative AI, thinking about training is really important for these models. And we have some data for ChatGPT 3.5. What's been really interesting to watch is as these tools develop, their training data becomes more and more secretive. So we know less and less about how they are trained. But with ChatGPT 3.5, it was a little bit open. So we know that one of the big areas of training data was the Common Crawl database, and that has 13 years, petabytes of web data, billions of pages in over 40 languages, and trillions of links. A couple things to mention there. This isn't all of the internet. These are select pages that are used based on algorithms, based on training. And also, while there's 40 different languages, English is still a predominant language that was used to train these tools. Additionally, what we've come to realize is in this data, there's lots of open data, data that we opened up, websites that we opened up, but there's lots and lots of data that wasn't opened up. Things like, movies, images, books, etc., which were not intended to be scraped, but they were. A second source of data is even more contentious than Common Crawl, and that's the Book3 database. Book3 database contains over 197,000 books. Again, it's a mix of open books and many copyrighted books. And just to see some of the challenges around copyright, put into ChatGPT your favorite book, ask it for a summary, ask it to create a worksheet, ask it to talk to one of the characters, and mostly it will be able to do this, which suggests a lot of these books that were scraped were copyrighted. And finally, Wikipedia, a huge tool in open education. We know that Wikimedia was scraped for these models. So as we're going through this workshop, it's good to think about what was scraped and what's the significance of how it was scraped, attribution, etc.
And
Well,
just so we're all on the same page, and just to give sort of a basic definition of OER, to start with, so open education is a bit of an umbrella term, but essentially it can be understood as a collection of practices that utilize technologies to facilitate things like collaboration, transparency, flexible learning, and open sharing in order to remove barriers to education, as well as to empower educators and learners. Open educational resources are an important aspect of open education, and they are teaching and learning resources, and they can be anything. They can be full courses, modules, textbooks, streaming videos, problem sets, tests, and any other materials that are free of cost and access barriers, and which also carry legal permission for open use. This legal permission is often granted through the use of an open copyright license, the most common being a Creative Commons license, which would allow anybody to freely use, adapt, or share that resource anytime, anywhere, and really for any purpose.
so what we wanted to do is get right into doing a little activity, an activity together. And so what I'll get you to do now is to open the worksheet that I shared with you. And I'm going to demonstrate what I'd like you to do now. But overall, what we're going to have you do is create a chapter section of an open textbook based on a topic that you are fairly knowledgeable about. So on the worksheet, I'm just going to go on here and demonstrate. If you take a look at activity number 1, creating an open textbook chapter, what you'll see we've included there is a prompt. So as a psychology professor, write a 1,000-word, extremely detailed textbook section of a chapter, first-year college students, on the processes involved in sleep, including learning objectives at the start and a glossary of terms at the end. And then what we've included below that is some aspects that we would like included in the textbook. So the guidelines should have a single page. It should include learning objectives, etc. So to do this activity, if you want, you can just revise the prompt that I included, and you can think of a topic that you want to do, or you can write your own prompt. So once you have the prompt, go into an LLM. I'm going to use ChatGPT in this case, and run the prompt. A couple things to mention in the prompt as we're running this is I've included as a psychology professor. So I gave the prompt a role, and we know that by giving the prompt a role, we tend to get better output from the particular prompt. Also, I included a lot of specific details in there. So here's the chapter on sleep now. And it's breaking down most of the key elements that we double checked kind of what sleep textbooks look like. And most of the key elements are in here, although without expertise in this area, it's going to be very difficult for us to figure out what's accurate and what's inaccurate. So over to you now. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do that. And after you've run your textbook page, think about what worked, what was missing, and what were some of the challenges about prompting the tool. So over to you. 5 minutes, create a textbook chapter in a disciplinary area you know well. All right, so why don't we share back now? Could a couple people raise their virtual hands and jump in and kind of share again what the topic they did and the quality of the results for them? What errors did you find? What was accurate, etc.? Yeah, Kathleen, please go ahead.
Hi. So I did mine on book history.
Okay.
And overall the information was fairly accurate, but I did notice it was a completely Western centric view. It only talked about things in the West, European, and so I had to actually ran a second prompt and asked it to also include Eastern practices. But yeah, it completely skipped that in the first
Okay,
run through.
that's interesting. And we will talk about bias. So when you ran an Eastern, asked for specifically Eastern texts, what was the result from that?
So I asked it to include both Eastern and Western. And so it kind of had the same information for the Western ones and then just started sprinkling in some other information as well. And I
Okay.
used ChatGPT.
Okay, so it sounds like it wasn't as kind of integrated and as you wanted, but you were able to get a sprinkling in. And I see a question in the chat. Which platform did you use for that?
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT. Thanks for sharing. Would one other person like to share the results? So what the topic they did and what the results were like?
Hi, I'd like to share, but I am having difficulty finding the hand raising function,
Okay,
if
no,
you
no
don't
problem.
mind.
Jump in,
Okay.
please.
All right. I asked a very specific question about something, and I'm astonished at how uh, complete the results are. I used ChatGPT, and my topic was I asked about the trade dynamics between the Jamestown settlers and the indigenous people
Yeah.
prior to 1622. And I'm ready to retire because this thing is outdoing me.
Okay.
I'm like, oh my God, there goes my job. But no, in all seriousness, I think the practice needs to be what you put in is what you'll get out. And the more specific uh, the information, I think, the better the quality.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. And so you were using ChatGPT for that as well.
That's correct.
Wonderful. So thanks for sharing. It's great to hear the results of what you've done. And I hear a mix here, noting some of the bias that exists within ChatGPT, as well as some of the quality that comes out of it. And we're not going to go into these tools today, but I would like to draw your attention to some of the tools that are coming out of generative AI, such as deep research tools. So Google Gemini has a deep research tool. ChatGPT now, if you use the paid version, has a deep research tools. And these go much deeper into specific topics with full references. They're not quite journal level references, but it's been a real game changer for me in terms of the quality that comes out of the output. And I'm just going to read one comment from Miranda. I found my results were super basic and there needs to be more discussed. And absolutely, this is a critique we've heard quite a bit in these workshops, is sometimes the output of generative AI can be quite surfacey. And also the second point there, some of its points are wrongish, and we need to think about, again, we'll talk about that later, how we sift through, how we evaluate the output of these tools. All right, thanks for doing that activity. And now I'm going to turn it over to Will, who's going to talk about ancillary resources in Gen AI.
Sure. And so we're just going to take the same activity and go one step farther. So often in textbooks, but in our course materials, we're not just dealing with pure text, but we're also have things like quizzes or summative self-reflective questions. And I'm going to ask you to do sort of the same activity. It's in the worksheet that we shared. And I'm just going to share my screen and share that. We're going to ask you to go back to your tool that you've been using and using the same topic to ask it to create a 4-question summative quiz. So we have a general prompt here. As a psychology professor, create a summative multiple choice quiz about psychology of sleep. Create 4 questions with alternatives for each question and mark 1 as the correct answer. So you can go ahead and do this directly. I'm going to use it in ChatGPT, but if you want to write your own prompt again, that would be fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and just stick it in there and see what it comes back with. We're going to give you maybe a little less time this time to go through this quiz, but it will take the next 3 minutes. And have ChatGPT or another Gen AI tool create a 4-question quiz for you. And we'll be back in 4 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes. And while you work on that, I'd just like to point out, similar to what we did with the textbook section, with Lucas, you'll notice in the prompt we've created, we've given the tool a role. So we're saying act as a psychology professor. So this helps set sort of the level and sort of target that we're asking the ChatGPT or the AI tool to generate or work with. Okay, we're gonna be back in just 2 minutes. Okay, why don't we come back, and similar to what we do with the textbook chapter, if somebody wouldn't mind unmuting and giving us your thoughts on how the quiz turned out. Was it, some of the questions you might want to think is, was it accurate? Did it actually write quiz questions where they had that the answer was right that they were giving, then the wrong answers were wrong? Was it at the level that you think would be appropriate for your students or your institution? Would anybody care to share their experience?
I'll jump in.
Sure.
I actually asked a question about architectural foundations. And yeah, I'm quite impressed with both the chapter that it developed. I mean, it's a relatively technical area, but there's, things you'd want to mention. And from what, when I scanned over, the chapter seemed quite comprehensive. And I like the detail in the quiz questions that it asked, and they do seem accurate to me.
And perfect. Is there anything that you would ask it to improve upon?
Well, I mean, it was general questions about a foundation. So it's providing some specific answers in terms of different types of foundation you use in different sort of circumstances. So I think the next thing would be, that's probably a little too general. So if I was looking for something more specific, I'd want it to write something on very specific topics, since it is a technical subject. So I would go more deep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Does anybody else want to share their experience with the quiz?
I noticed that in my instance, I did not ask it for feedback on incorrect answers, but it gave it to me anyway.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
that was very helpful. I probably would have looked at it and go, well, that would be nice, but it already did it.
So we often hear from instructors that they feel like this, when they first ask it to write a quiz, that it could be a big time saver, because it can be hard to sort of do that. But it wouldn't replace the instructor for writing the quizzes. It would be a tool to help them sort of get started with it. I do just want to show really quick another quick demonstration. So a lot of the companies are kind of figuring out that, you know, these are time-saving tools for instructors, and they're building some connections through this. So one of the tools that's often used in OER is a tool called H5P, and H5P is an open source tool that allows people to create interactive content, and it's used for all sorts of things like writing quizzes or writing true and false or fill in the blank and neat interactive content. It turns out you can actually format the right format in a tool like ChatGPT so that it can be easily read with that. So I'm going to take that same question, but I'm just going to share my screen.
Can I just mention something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm imagining myself as a biology professor asking for a description of the process of mitosis or cell division.
Mhm.
And it gave me 4 questions with feedback. Then I asked it to provide me a diagram of the process. And sure enough, it did. And it's looks pretty good.
Oh, great. Yeah,
Yeah, so that was interesting. I didn't think it could do that.
very neat. And does it provide, did you ask it to just provide the diagram, or did you have the diagram embedded within questions as well? So,
And no, I didn't have it embedded in the question. It was a separate prompt.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So it is, again, these tools are advancing all the time, and image and diagram generation is definitely an area where I'm seeing like huge leaps forward every month, I feel like, on that.
And I'm just going to jump in really
Yeah.
quick. If you're in the STEM field, I also would point to ChatGPT 03, which is available to paid subscribers, and that's a lot better for computation. I would also point to Wolfram Alpha GPT. Wolfram Alpha is a computational engine which does things like diagramming. That is built in as a custom GPT, again, typically with the paid version. So that's 2 ways. I think when Gen AI was first getting popular, STEM was an area where it wasn't as good. Those tools really have improved it.
Thank you very much.
Can you
So
repeat the name of the first one, please? The first tool? I'm sorry.
The first tool is called ChatGPT 03.
Oh, 03. Thank you.
It's again built into the paid model.
So just to do the quick demonstration of some of the linkages that are creating. So I'm just going to copy in another prompt.
Can you zoom in a little bit?
Yeah, that is exactly the same, in that I'm asking it to create a multiple choice quiz, but I'm asking it to provide a specific output, formatted output. So it's asking to, you know, to suffix each distractor with some text code, and don't attach any labels or formatting and numbering. So I'm going to go ahead and have it generate this. And it'll take just a minute, and you'll see it's outputting as pre-formatted code. So now I have this, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And I will say that this usually works when I demonstrate it, but about 1 in every 5 times it doesn't work. So I've copied this code down, and now I'm just going to go to H5P. So this is just a quick view of the H5P tool. And I want to create a quiz or a question set, because that's what I've asked it to put out there. So I'm going to create a new quiz. I'm going to call it Sleep Study Quiz. And I'm going to go ahead, and here it's got the questions, and I can go ahead and actually build them, but it actually has a text button. I'm going to go into the text button, which is just the raw text, and I'm going to go ahead and just paste in the code that I just outputted from ChatGPT, and I'm going to go ahead and hit create. And it'll take a minute for this to render, but it should work. But so here we now see I have the first quiz question. What is the primary function of REM sleep? It plays a role in memory consolidation. I'm going to go ahead and check, and it's correct. And I can move on to the next question. What part of the brain is most active during REM sleep? This one I'm going to choose a wrong answer. It gives me the feedback and tells me that I'm wrong. So without doing any work, I now have a formatted quiz. The nice thing about ChatGTP is, or sorry, H5P, is I can go ahead and embed this wherever I would like to embed it. So if I've been writing a psychology textbook, I can grab the embed code here and put it in there. If I'm using a learning management platform like Canvas or Brightspace, I can paste it into Canvas and have that as part of my text. So the companies are sort of figuring out, we can provide sort of ways for these connections. And in H5P's cases, they call it recipes. So if you go back into that handout, I did put the link in for Gen AI recipes. You can click on it, and this will tell you sort of the codes that you can ask it to format it. So it'll provide example prompts. So if you're creating an open textbook or creating interactive course content, they'll have some of the recipes you can use to help generate those codes there. Going back to our slides.
And I'll just add to that while you're putting the slides up. You can often get generative AI to write in different formats and upload them into different systems that way. So for example, getting it to write in QTI and uploading it to a learning management system, or getting it to write in WordPress HTML and then copy pasting into WordPress.
Perfect. So now that we've played around a little bit with the Gen AI tool and how to create some content, we wanted to look specifically at how such tools can be used for OER. So let me just start by saying OER is really a great strategy for course content. So you can adopt it by using OER in a course, which saves time and money. So online versions are often free for instructors and students. You can download and save the offline versions in multiple formats, which can help with accessibility because students can change the format to the tool that they're using or access them in low bandwidth situations. There's no access codes needed. There's no expiration dates for the materials. And because of the open copyright license, there's no need to gain permission or to pay to use, copy, or distribute the OER amongst an unlimited number of students. You can also adapt OER or customize it to provide meaningful contextualized resources for your students. This means you can modify it to teach your learning and teaching goals, your student needs, your curriculum. You can change its format again. You can make it more reflective of the diversity of experience of backgrounds of your students. You can also adapt it to make it something completely, or you can also remix it with other pieces of OER to make it completely new. And this can include simple activities like updating a textbook to have new images. One of my favorite projects that happened at UBC was an instructor who was using an open psychology textbook, but he realized that all the pictures of people in the psychology textbook, which had been written in the US, were not at all reflective of the students in his class. So he spent a summer basically just finding openly licensed images of families and people and replacing them in his open textbook so that his students felt like the textbook was more reflective of their experiences. Or another experience where you remix sort of a larger project to create something new. There was a project where they took neuroanatomy resources and videos that had been openly licensed and remixed that with a intro to psychology textbook to create a brain and behavior textbook that fit the curriculum of the course that they were teaching. So remixing is another great sort of process or freedom that OER allows. And of course, you can also make completely new content and share it as OER. And this is often the case that instructors are writing textbooks or taking their course notes that they've developed over time and publishing them into a new resource or a new website or new press books that they can then share with their students free of charge. So Lucas is going to share some examples of how Gen AI could be used for each of these activities. And sorry, Lucas, I think you're muted.
One of my least favorite moments of every day. We'll just step through some of the ways that we can start using generative AI to adapt, to create, to remix OER. And the first one point we wanted to share is this quote from David Wiley. LLMs will dramatically increase the speed of creating the informational resources that compromise the content infrastructure. Of course, the drafts of these informational resources will need to be reviewed and improvements will need to be made. I previously worked at BC Campus supporting open education textbook projects. And what surprised, it wasn't a huge surprise, but what was really obvious in that role is just how much work creating a textbook was for a faculty member. And the idea of being able to shortcut this a little bit, I think is really powerful when we're thinking about open. And our demonstration of that was the textbook chapter that you created. Another strength of LLMs or tools like ChatGPT is adapting OER. I think many of you are already using generative AI as a tool for adapting your own work, but for OER, it can be quite a powerful tool. So you can adapt by level. In this case, act as a learning designer and adapt the following open educational resource for grade 12 level learners. You can adapt by language, so we can translate across multiple languages. You can adapt by format, so create a table using the following content. And you can adapt for accessibility, create alternative text for this image, or make this text more accessible, a simple prompt like that. So let me demonstrate each of these now, and in a little bit, you're going to have an opportunity to also do some of these adapting. So what I've done is I've taken an open textbook about clear communication, and you'll see at the bottom I've attributed it. I think when we're doing this work where we're adapting things, etc., it's really important in open education that we still do things like think about who wrote it and how we're going to attribute it to the author. So I've copied that now. And what I'm going to do is go to OpenAI. Let's create a new tab. You know what? Let's use Claude just to change it up a little bit. So I'm going to use Claude now, which is a large language model developed by Amazon. Claude is also free for use, although it does have some limits on it. So I'm going to paste all of this text into Claude.
Lucas, would you mind sharing your screen?
Oh, I am sharing now, according to... Can I get a thumbs up if you see my screen?
I can see it.
Oh,
I
sorry.
can see it.
Okay, perfect.
My
Will
fault.
was
Sorry.
just
Yeah.
tricking me. He keeps me on my toes with that kind of stuff. So I've inputted the textbook chapter, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the worksheet, and I'm going to adapt it in a couple different ways. So let's try, first of all, to change the level. Act as a learning designer and adapt this resource for a grade 12 level. And what we can do now is Claude now is going to adapt it. And you'll see what it's doing is it's adding some more heading levels. It's simplifying the language a little bit. And again, I can change this based on heading level or based on level. I could change it based on Kincaid reading levels. I could say something like explain it like I'm 5, but I can change the levels. Let's try one more. And again, this time, let's try ChatGPT, just because I'm doing my best to be tool agnostic here. I'm going to copy the same piece in. I'll paste it in here. You'll notice I'm doing a clean paste every time. Part of the reason for that is these tools only have so much memory. If I asked it to do something else, it might work, but it'll probably be more effective if I just paste it in again. And this time, I'm going to say act as an expert in translation and translate this into Persian. And it's going to give me the OER now translated into Persian. I will acknowledge that I don't speak Persian, so I don't have the expertise to assess the quality. I did this workshop or a similar one with a colleague, and she does speak Persian, and she found it was quite accurate in the examples that we use. So lots of different ways that we can use these tools for adapting different OER. And Will's going to show you an example now of how an instructor at UBC has used generative AI to adapt their open press book in forestry. Go ahead, Will, you can take over.
Thanks. So this is a press book that's developed by Neil Leverage, who is an instructor in our Faculty of Forestry, and this is around a communication strategy, effective communication textbook for forestry professionals. And one of the things that he wanted to do was he wanted to use AI to create sort of a accessible audio version of this textbook. Rather than a word for word, though, he wanted it more of a summarized version of this. So this is just one particular chapter, Introduction to Academic and Professional Communications. And he's like, do you want to choose how you experience the chapter? So he's a person who loves to experiment with different things. And he decided to create a few different genres of this audio adaptation using various AI tools. So I think I can get this to play. But one of the first version was what he calls the normal boring.
Communication in
This
natural
is
resources.
AI voice
How
that an
information
AI
influences
generated summary of this
environmental
chapter.
perceptions and behaviors. Effective communication is critical in shaping public perceptions and behaviors regarding environmental issues.
So that's the normal version. I hope people could hear that. So he then decided, well, maybe that's not the most effective way for students to listen to the book. So he created a few different versions. So he created a fairy tale version.
Foundations. Communication in natural resources. Communication is powerful. It shapes how people see the world and how they act.
And I'm just gonna, I'll go just very briefly, documentary style, which sounds a lot to me like a CBC article, radio show.
Picture this. You're deep in the forest, surrounded by the towering trees of British Columbia. The air is cool.
And then he did a Serenity style.
Communication in natural resources. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're standing in the heart of a quiet forest where the only sounds are the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft flow of a nearby stream.
So one of my favorite things about this sort of story and his experimenting with this. So this textbook's in development, but he's begun using it with his students to get feedback on their experiences with it. One of the things that he's traditionally done is he's given sort of a weekly reading comprehension quiz. So making sure his students are engaging with the text and coming back and reading it. And he says, on average, students get about 6 or 7 on that. So when I put these summative summary AI into it, the student scores rocketed to 9s and 10s completely. And one of the questions I asked students is, which one of these sort of genres are they engaging with in reading this? And he said, by and far, they came back that they were engaging with them all. So students were going through and listening to the multiple genres multiple times. And part of that might be the novelty of this experience. And as students get, more bogged down into the classes, they might not go through it all, but it really shows this like providing sort of another pathway through the information and through the knowledge that you want students to acquire, the information you want them to process, providing multiple pathways through that is sort of a pathway for success for helping students learn the knowledge, the information that you want them to learn. And these AI tools can help do it. What audio tool was used for this? That is a good question. He told me, Lucas, do you remember offhand what?
I don't offhand, no.
Yeah. But he used ChatGPT to create the summaries, and then he did feed them into a different Gen AI audio tool. And I can look that up and come back with that. So Lucas, I'm gonna hand it back to you to talk about remixing.
Yeah, so we looked at different ways of adapting. Generative AI can also be used as a way to remix different texts. So for example, combining 2 texts together on different topics, or adding specific examples to a certain text. And I'm going to demo that one and then we're going to give you a chance to play with this a little bit. One moment. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to take this same clear communication article and we will paste this into Claude today. I'm going to add a different prompt this time. And what I'm going to ask it to do is take this text and add specific examples from UBC massively open online course to the following OER about clear communication. So what I'm asking it to do here is to take information that it should have, specific examples of UBC MOOCs, and mix that or remix that into the textbook. And now we're getting our textbook chapter. And you'll see what it's doing here is it says, for example, in the UBC's Introduction to Marketing MOOC, course expectations are clearly laid out in an introductory video. So it's actually going through these MOOCs and it's adding those examples in. Luckily, I've worked around these MOOCs, so I do know that generally the examples it's used are correct, although I would need to go through those in more detail. So generative AI can be a powerful tool when we think about adapting and when we think about remixing OER. And I want to turn it over to you now. So what I'd like you to do is to use that chapter section that I shared with you around communication. I put a link to it on your worksheet. Or use your own chapter section that you created about your own topic. And I'd like you to remix it, adapt it in different ways. So try translating it, try changing the level, etc. Try some other ways as well. How could you adapt it? So I'll give you 5 minutes to do that again. Again, use the text you've created, or if you don't want to, use that open textbook chapter that I included. So please go ahead. I'll actually give you 4 minutes on this whisper time. Okay, why don't we share back now? So would a couple people, I think we have time for 2 people, to share back how they adapted their text and what the results were like. And Charisse, I saw you unmuted there. Did you want to jump in? Nope. Who wants to share the results of what they adapted, how they adapted, and what the results were? Okay, and I'm just gonna, Jamie just shared in the chat, my space is so noisy, so I'll type my results there. I adapted it to Gaelic, thinking it is becoming a lost language, so I thought it might be more challenging. It adapted the text quite easily. I'm not sure of the accuracy. I also adapted to grades 1 level. I would say it was possibly higher than grade 1, but it was a lower level than my initial chapter. Thanks for sharing that. And it's interesting, Gaelic. It's amazing what generative AI has scraped. Does anyone else want to share what the results were from their adapting of the material? Okay, before we move on, I'm just going to share. I did a different kind of adapting for this. And what I did is I used Claude and I asked Claude to create a web artifact. And I just wanted to do this to show kind of how far you can push adapting these resources. So I actually pasted in that whole communication text and I asked Claude to make a web resource based on that. And you'll see what it did is it designed almost a module for this particular content. So I think when we think about adapting, we can think about language, we can think about level, but these newer tools are starting to get to the point where we can create an entire module adapting a textbook chapter with a single prompt command. So thanks for sharing for that. And what we'd like to talk about now is to take a little bit of a turn and to talk about some of the tensions and the issues with generative AI. And I think more than any tool that I've worked around in the past 15 years, generative AI has some of the most significant issues. And I really think we need to think, especially from the open community, is how do we think critically about these tools and how do we use them in a way that is ethical? So, number one is intellectual property. And I'm going to give you a chance to read this quote by Naomi Klein for a second. And I love this second paragraph. These models are enclosure and appropriation machines, devouring and privatizing our individual lives, as well as our collective intellectual and artistic inheritance. So this is a pretty strong quote, but what we do know is that generative AI scraped a lot of copyrighted work. It scraped a lot of indigenous writings. It scraped a lot of our own work. I'm sure if many of you have been online, been on Reddit, been on X, been on Facebook, your writing has been scraped. If you've written a blog, it's been scraped and used for training these models. In addition, with open education, we have such a rich history of attribution. And I think one of the goals of creating open resources was that it could be attributed to the author. Well, with training generative AI, we lose this attribution. And this is quite significant when we think about OER, when we think about generative AI. This is a second quote about it from Schroeder. Given that the 1976 Act of Copyright Law necessitates human authorship, AI-generated works aren't eligible for registration. As far as the US copyright is concerned, the outputs of generative AI programs like ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion lack copyright protection, barring any drastic shifts. Generative AI outputs will continue enter the public domain immediately. So when we use generative AI, our output is not copyrightable generally. I will say since this quote, there has been a court case in the US that allows generative AI textual work to be copyrighted if you've made changes to it. However, images still are not copyrightable. They're automatically in the public domain. Will.
Yeah, and so I'll just note that copyright around AI is changing quickly and may change even more as more court cases, as more and more lawsuits work their way forward through the courts. But generally, I want to talk a little bit about the idea that maybe copyright, when it comes to the work, isn't really the right ethical framing for Gen AI. This is an image of the Megaface project. I don't know if people are familiar with Flickr, but Flickr is a large online image sharing platform, and it's one of the old school ones that have been around forever. And one of the things that Flickr really championed was the idea that photographers or anybody could take a picture, they could upload it to Flickr, and as part of the upload process, they could attach a Creative Commons license to it, which essentially made that picture openly licensed. This allowed other people to reuse it, and has in fact been a great thing for open educational resources because it's one of the largest sources of openly licensed images. This photo comes from a project that came out of Flickr. So in 2019, there were roughly 400 million Creative Commons licensed photos on Flickr. So that year, Yahoo, which owned Flickr at the time, in conjunction with the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and other social media companies like Snapchat, plus something called InQtel, which is the US CIA affiliated venture capitalist firm used a quarter of all of the openly licensed images to create a huge machine learning data set called YFCC 100M, the 100M standing for 100 million images in that. Um, and as part of that data set, a consortium of universities and research institutions led by the University of Washington in the United States created a derivative data set called the Megaface Project. And this was a data set that allowed universities to conduct research into specific aspects of vision-oriented machine learning, such as AI image creation, but also facial recognition software. These two sort of data sets, the YFCC 100M and the Megaface data sets, are by some counts the largest use of OER ever. These are huge amounts of hundreds of millions of openly licensed materials being reused for a specific purpose. And it's generally seen as one of the most significant examples of openly licensed content being reused. But what I want to call attention to is that for subjects of these photographs that are part of these data sets, the issue is not really whether or not copyright was broken when they were added to it, or whether the terms of the CC licenses allowed the use of this. But the fact that this kind of reuse, that maybe I uploaded pictures of my kid's birthday party and put a Creative Commons license, and now that's being used to train facial recognition software, was not expected by the users or by the Creative Commons license community or the open community. And the concern is less copyright and more that maybe this use invades their privacy and takes away their agency. Sir Tekowski and Warsaw, who wrote a white paper sort of about this use, really likes to point out in their conclusion, and it's a great white paper and I encourage you to read it, that, that research institutions and universities were involved in creating this and reusing this, and voluntary consent to participate in research and the right to withdraw from research at any time has been really the gold standard in guiding ethical principle regarding research with humans. But with AI data sets, with much of AI data sets being created by research institutions, are these rights there? Can we withdraw our data from AI data sets, particularly AI data sets created by universities? Next slide, if you don't mind, Lucas. And so, of course, the use of OER for unintended or extractive areas isn't entirely new. So the paradox of open is it's both a challenge to and an enabler of the concentrations of power. And that's Alex Tarkowski calls this the paradox of open. And I'd like to highlight during the land acknowledgement, we said that open can sometimes be in tension with indigenous and traditional ways of knowing. And this tension exists because open is often primarily based on copyright and intellectual property law. So Daniel Heath Justice, who's a professor in UBC's Department of First Nations and Indigenous Study, describes the core of the issue this way, and I'm going to read his quote. He says, quote, "Knowledge is never about individuals. It is about communities. It is about genealogies. It is about histories. Community has to be the heart of understanding of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination. When we're talking about multiple communities in dialogue, we have to think very much about relationships of power and how power also impacts knowledge production, knowledge maintenance, but also knowledge dissemination. Who decides which knowledge should be shared, to what end, and why?" And so these are the kind of questions that I think need to be addressed, and they're not just easily copyright questions. I like this quote from Paul Stacey here because he's basically saying we need to move away from thinking about open licensing in OER, from making something open to being something open and responsible. And we have seen some movements in there. So again, drawing back to indigenous and traditional knowledge, there's things called like the TK knowledge licenses. So the traditional knowledge TK labels identify and clarify community-specific rules and responsibilities regarding access and future use of traditional knowledge, and they're things that can be applied directly to resources that are indigenous knowledge and traditionally based. And they'll invite you viewers to respect community protocols or indicate what activities the community has approved and are generally acceptable. So in the AI space, we're also seeing the sort of creation of new labels. One is the RAIL licenses. So RAIL is responsible AI licenses. And these allow developers to restrict the use of their AI technologies in order to prevent irresponsible and harmful applications. So this might be somebody who's created open code or open data sets or open algorithms. Rather than just putting a copyright license on it, they might put a rail license on it, which will include behavioral use clauses that go beyond copyright to restrict things like using the resulting AI tool in a way that violates laws or harms or exploits minors or impersonates others or discriminates based upon social behavior or personality characteristics or exploits vulnerabilities of a specific group of people. So thinking again, like how can we think about the idea of copyright licenses and Creative Commons that have always been used in OER and expand it to thinking a little bit more about being open and responsible. Next slide. Look.
I think we've touched on a little bit that in some of your earlier experiments, creating a textbook chapter, is generative AI creates an interesting challenge with accuracy. Generative AI tools are always 100% confident. They're actually very, very confident and enthusiastic, but maybe 70 to 80% accurate. And what that means is that as creators, as people adapting OER, we need to figure out how we're going to sift through it and evaluate it for these errors. And we're already seeing lots of significant issues with this. I just read an article yesterday which said that judges are starting to get frustrated because of the number of lawyers who are bringing ChatGPT written cases into the courtroom. I've read about 5 now, and it turns out that sometimes these tools generate fake case law. So they're getting reprimanded by the different justice societies for these errors. So when we're creating open educational resources with generative AI, we need to be able to take the time and have the expertise to figure out these hallucinations and errors. And I kind of draw back to when we were talking about what the definition of generative AI is. I think the fact that it is using word prediction rather than thinking or reasoning means that its output is based on word frequency, and we're going to see these hallucinations and these errors. So I really like this chart from UNESCO. This came out a couple years ago now. When is it safe to use ChatGPT? Number one, does it matter if the output is true? No. Well, it's probably safe to use. Yes. Do you have the expertise to verify that that output is accurate? And the more the generative AI develops in capabilities, the more complex this expertise needs to be. When I evaluate educational materials or educational research that I've created with generative AI, I have, I only have an MEd, but I've been working in this field for about 15 years. Generally, I'm able to tease out issues with it, but pretty soon it's only going to be people with PhDs or at the faculty level who are going to be able to sift through this. And I guess that brings up the other question is when we're creating OER, how much time are we going to need to spend making these corrections and finding these errors out? And it's even when we adapt. So a study that I was reading showed that ChatGPT 3.5, when you summarized information, it was still having a 30% error rate. With ChatGPT 4 Omega and 01, that's down to a 1 or 2% error rate. But even when we're just transforming text, it has a significant error rate that we need to go through. Next is bias. Like the internet, we know that generative AI tools have bias built into them. So generative AI, this is a study by Vassal et al. They found that generative AI tools, including ChatGPT 4, were stereotyping and erasing different minority groups. So frequently when we use these tools, we see biases built into them. An interesting example, Will and I sat down before this workshop and we prompted ChatGPT to give us a portrait of a typical Canadian family. And these are our typical Canadian families. If I've done this search many, many times and I often find the same looking white family. Sometimes they're wearing plaid vests. Usually they're in the forest. So again, how do we think about this bias when we're creating open educational resources? And in addition, we need to think about the privacy with these tools. Currently, lots of institutional and private data is being put into these tools. They're very convenient to use. But in addition, it reminds me of the internet in 1997. These tools are very vulnerable privacy-wise. And I don't just mean in terms of training data, I mean in terms of privacy, vulnerability, and leaks. Can I get a thumbs up if you've heard of the Palm Forever hack? This is a fascinating hack that was done a year and a half ago by a Google engineer with ChatGPT. The Google engineer asked ChatGPT to write the word Palm Forever. And it didn't write the word Palm Forever. It said Palm, 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 Palm. And then it started sharing names, emails, phone numbers from its login database. Very much like the computer at the end of War Games, if you remember that movie. So these tools have significant vulnerabilities, and we need to think about what we're putting into them right now. And finally, we need to think about equity. When we're working with our students around open education, how are we going to think about equitable use? One student is going to be able to prompt these tools and make them sing. Another student may not know that much about prompting. A student may have access to more robust AI. I pay about $100 a month in total for AI subscriptions just to get quality output. How do we think about this equity when we're working with our students? And finally, the environmental impact of these tools. We know that generative AI tools have a significant environmental impact, both in terms of water usage as well as carbon footprint. So again, how can we use these tools in ways that are more sustainable? And I would say it brings up the larger question. How do we think about our digital footprint in general when we think about sustainability? And when we think about things like water usage. So a couple things that we can do to mitigate some of these issues. Number one, be cautious with your use of generative AI content. So understanding that we are responsible for the final output, how are we going to be able to check and understand the accuracy and the bias? And again, spend time reviewing AI generated content. Be transparent with your use of generative AI. Be cautious with intellectual property. And I think this is really difficult. Again, this is still going through the courts. What does caution look like? There's a few tools out there that are starting to ingest more open textbooks. I think that's one way we can be more cautious about what we're using. And finally, ensure accurate representation. Over to you, Will.
Sure. And so we'd like to just take a moment and pause and look back at the sort of textbook page that you've created, the quiz. What needs to be done to actually make that into the OER, and should it be made into OER? And we just wanted to open up some space here. If you want to unmute and tell us your thoughts on this, and really like how do we reconcile the power of these tools with the ethical consideration and goals of OER and the open educational community? So if you have any thoughts of like, can you take that page you made and make it into an open textbook or another piece of OER? Should you? Please let us know your thoughts.
I'm just going to mention that I attended David Wiley's talk last week at the OER conference, and what he said made a lot of sense to me. Is that I'm in a position where I'm encouraging the use of OER at Sask Polytechnic, But the challenges are great, you know, in terms of trying to find a custom textbook that's going to match your learning objectives, and then perhaps adapting it and investing time. So we're really investing in these custom solutions, which require a lot of staff time, which may not be funded. So I think, you know, the challenges in continuing to advocate for finding those solutions and creating those custom solutions make it a really difficult thing to continue to advocate for. And so, you know, if we're able to incorporate the generative AIs, and I really liked your chart that you provided, and the also the cautions in terms of what we need to be thinking about if we are going to work with an AI to create something. But we can create a solution with it that's more justifiable, and that's probably ultimately going to be more effective in meeting the learning objectives that we're required to meet in our courses. So that's, I think, the greatest challenge, is that we can see the potential here, but I so appreciate the presentation and the cautions that you provided, but I don't see how we're going to stop this from happening, honestly.
Thanks, and yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. Like, we often talk about OER as being free, but it's actually incredibly expensive, and it's paid for in the highest currency, which is faculty and staff time to create, to adapt, to teach effectively with it, and definitely. You know, I think there's a reason these AI tools are really coming down, because they are a way to make some of this very efficient and take some of that burden away. In order for us to then be able to use the freed up time, it should be going back to our teaching and learning, and spending our time directly with our students, and not, you know, editing text or trying to figure out adapting or all of this. Absolutely. And I'll just note, like, using in the comment, there was you know, in terms of ethics is also the climate crisis, and as Lucas points out, yeah, absolutely. There are real climate impacts to the use of OER. And you know, there are some solutions, such as using a model that runs off your own desktop or laptop, which is one way to reduce that. But that also comes with a learning curve of how to set up an AI on your own machine and run it, and that can often be slower than the online versions as well. Yeah, the struggle with the lack of attribution in AI created content. Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's been a fundamental piece of the OER movement that we should be always providing attribution, and I love this because it is, you know, sort of fundamental to scholarship, is that we should be providing for attribution, and AI just has completely, for the most part, done away with that. I'd like to also just point out another aspect of, like, that Lucas touched on upon, that is, oftentimes AI tools will incorporate what you put into them into their data training sets. So not only will, if you're working on an open textbook, will that open textbook be part of its training set, but you won't be attributed for that. So it is stealing the work that we're using it to do in some ways as well.
I'm also just going to jump in and mention, I'm going to initiate a poll here. We'd really appreciate some feedback from the people that did today. So the session will carry on, but I am going to initiate the poll and just ask if you take a couple minutes to give us some feedback on it.
Perfect. And while you do that, why don't we go ahead and move on to looking at some of the future aspects of where AI might be pushing OER. So one of the sort of, if you don't mind going on to the next slide, Lucas, one of the sort of things that I hope to see is more focus on open source AI. So this is a definition that comes from the Open Source Institute, or sorry, Open Source Initiative, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to educate and advocate about the benefits of open source software rather than proprietary software. And you'll see this definition, I think, has a lot of similar ideas to it that are behind OER and other open source initiatives. So an open source AI would be an AI that grants the freedom to use the system for any purpose without having to ask for permission, to study how the system works and its components, so you can remove that black box. You would have the freedom to modify the system for any purpose, including to change its outputs, and to share the system for others to use without modifications for any purpose. And the definition goes on to say this isn't just the freedoms inherent in a fully functional AI system, but also to discrete elements of a system. And I think we need to be pushing for more of that in our AI. If you don't mind going on to the next slide, Martin Weller, I think, really hit this well. And he says, much of AI and OER sees education as a product and instead should be thought more of as a process. This emphasizes the benefits of open educational practices in promoting social justice, developing community, and changing pedagogy. However, it's hard to say that AI systems based on closed box algorithms where we can't understand what they're doing, unknown data sources, and controlled by large corporations, particularly large corporations in the US, with an agenda of expansion and control, are actually in the spirit of open, whatever the practical advantages of using them. So if openness in education means anything, it should be about advocating for openness in these areas, transparency around models, clarity of data sources, and whether you own the content that is being used by the AI models, and open source approaches to developing more AI. And I think Canada and I think Canadian institutions have a role to play in this. Next slide, Lucas. David Wiley has been a proponent to say as well that, AI will probably be shifting away from just tech, will be making open resources shift away from just text to more of a dialogue-based model. So what if in the future educators didn't write textbooks? What if we only wrote highly structured collection of prompts? Wiley has argued that Gen AI has the potential to act less like a textbook and more like a personal tutor. And he says, quote, in Bloom's 2 Sigma study, in which Bloom and colleagues demonstrated that the average student who is tutored full-time outperforms 98% of students who learn in a traditional classroom setting. So tutoring is a really powerful teaching method, and maybe Gen AI will have this capability broadly available for all of our students at a reasonable cost. What will that look like in terms of open? So we've seen a few things. I'm going to just share sort of a prompt from David's section. So I'm going to go back to ChatGPT really quick, Lucas, and just share this. So if I go into ChatGPT, maybe, all right, let me get to it. I'm going to write another prompt. So rather than maybe asking it to write that textbook chapter, I'm going to ask it to act as a tutor for a university level course. I'm going to create 5 questions that will test my understanding of the psychology of sleep. Ask me the questions one at a time, wait for my answer, and then give me feedback. If I didn't get the question right, ask me a related question to test my understanding, then ask the next question. So I'm not asking it to generate a textbook chapter. I'm asking it to generate a dialogue with me. So let's get started. What is the difference between REM sleep and non-REM sleep? I'm going to say REM is better for dreaming. And it's going to come back and say, you're correct, that is associated with dreaming, but it's going to go ahead and do it. Non-REM, on the other hand, are characterized by progressively deeper sleep, and it kind of goes into it. And then I'll say, to understand a question, what stage of sleep is most likely to experience restorative processes like growth hormone release? So again, it's not a linear text. It is a dialogue-based approach. We're actually seeing these, this is a copy and paste from a prompt into ChatGPT, but we're seeing these also in different forms of bots, and textbook companies, as we mentioned up front, are beginning to embed these in bots. Lucas, do you want to share that bot that you were going to share?
Why don't we miss that one just for time? Do you want to finish up with the last bot there?
Yeah, so I think if let's skip sharing the bots, but we have a couple minutes left, and maybe we'll just end it with asking for some reflective questions as well. So I just shared that activity, and I was going to ask you to maybe take that activity on yourself. So if you go into the the worksheet, under activity 4, if you want to try playing this with yourself, ask me 5 questions that test my understanding of the topic that you've been working on. Ask me the questions at one at a time, wait for the answer, and then give me feedback. then ask the next question. So we'll give everybody, we've got 3 minutes left. If you want to play with this, we'll give you exactly 1 minute, 30 seconds, and then we'll come back and just ask somebody to share what they thought of that approach. All right, if you've had a chance to ask it to prompt you on a dialogue-based conversation, how did that go? Does anybody want to share? Both in terms of, were these good questions? Did it respond to the actual answer that you put in?
Well, I tried giving an answer which wasn't entirely correct, but it called me out on it.
Nice.
All right. Do we want to open up just for some final questions?
Yeah, so thank you again for inviting us here today. That's sort of the overflow of our presentation. We got a little short for time at the end, but we really appreciate you taking time to join us today. And yeah, any questions that we can answer, please let us know.
No questions, but this has been a fantastic presentation. It's often you're fascinated by what you hear in conferences, from the stage. So I really appreciate this hands-on opportunity to learn.
Oh, thanks,
Thanks.
Therese. And I hope that this kind of opens up even more space of experimentation for you, because we're all kind of in this together, trying to figure out how to use this, how to think about it ethically.
Yeah, so there's a question. If you use AI to create an H5P element, how would you license the activity? This is the big question I think that comes up a lot for librarians and for those of us working, is like, I did this, can I apply a license to it? And again, this is sort of a gray space. So, I would go ahead and in my own practice, I would acknowledge and try to be transparent about the fact that I've used AI to generate that. But I would try to also suggest that the in the spirit of OER, I would keep it with the same things that I publish my open work out of under a license. But I would have that understanding that this may not be legally possible. If someone was to challenge or reuse it in a way that didn't apply with my terms, I may not have a legal basis for that. Again, this is a changing area, and there's lots of court cases going through at this point. So I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts on that.
Well, the US Copyright Office, of course, it's the US, and maybe we shouldn't be looking to the US so much anymore, but they had come out with a statement just a couple of weeks ago saying that as long as there is some human component within what's produced, that copyright would exist. So, I mean, it's the US, it's not Canada, so there's that. But there will be a third, that was a second statement, second copyright statement relative to Gen AI, and there will be a third statement, which perhaps will provide even more direction and what percentage that might be, because we don't know. We just know there needs to be some percentage, and a prompt was not sufficient, I think was the second thing they stated, that just putting a prompt in is not going to be sufficient to create copyright, that there's more involved, so.
And do I have time to answer one more question from Christopher there?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So Christopher asks, how do you think AI will impact or improve the accessibility of OER content? That's a great question. And when I worked with BC Campus supporting open textbooks, we spent so much time on the accessibility side of things. I think AI can be a huge time saver in accessibility for an open textbook. Things like appropriate heading levels, alt text for images, even thinking about universal design for learning and having multiple different ways of representation built into the textbook, that can be done quite easily right now with generative AI, and there'll be more tools to do that. Maybe a second part of the question, though, is then when we look at David Wiley's idea of a more interactive textbook, we also need to acknowledge these tools themselves have accessibility issues. So we need to think about, if we are using generative AI through and getting students to prompt it, what's the accessibility on the tool itself? I know previously tools like ChatGPT had issues when someone was using a screen reader. So how do we keep an eye on accessibility with the tools, but also leverage it for creating more accessible textbooks and spending less time on accessibility? All right. So I think that brings us to the end. I'm sure everyone has, lunch to get to. It's what, 12 o'clock in Saskatchewan now? But thanks so much for taking the time, or sorry, 12:30. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate all the sharing that you've done in the session. The slides we created are CC BY, so please feel free to use them. The recording will be out there as well, and play around with the worksheet. Thank you. Deanne says it's 1:30, so as you can see, I'm really bad with time differences. All right, so thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
7:30 p.m. in Ireland. Okay, dinner time. Wow, wonderful.
I want to step in and thank our two presenters for the workshop today. I think this was really valuable, very insightful, and I certainly appreciate both building excitement and then maybe tempering the excitement a little bit and suggesting maybe there's some things we need to think about with this. Lovely workshop. This was excellent. Thanks so much.